Well, hello everybody. As Harvey said, my name is William Large, and I'm the president of the British Society for Phenomenology. So if you want to ask me anything about that, please do. Hello, Joanna. I'm not going to say much more about that now, but if you do, as I said, if you do want to speak to me about it, please do. It's a great pleasure and a great honour to introduce you today to our first speaker, who's Professor Rudolf Bernet. I've known him for many years because he used to attend regularly the British Society for Phenomenology, so I've met him many times at Oxford. Rudolf Bernet is a professor of philosophy at the University of Leuven. Have I pronounced that right? I always get that wrong. Leuven or Leuven?
I'm Swiss, I'm neutral.
Right, okay. As many of you know, he's well known to many of you, and he's published numerous, too many articles to list, but hundreds and thousands, probably not thousands, but hundreds of articles on Husserl and phenomenology, and many books. I'm not going to list all your books, is that okay? Because we'll be here for so long that we'll never get to hear what Professor Bernet has to say. So as I said, it's a great honour for me to hear Bernet today. We have 1 hour, and Professor Bernet says his paper is going to be 40-45 minutes. Is that correct? 40-45 minutes. And so then it's about, I suppose, 15 to 20 minutes questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Thank you very much, the organizers, for letting me come to this place where I have never been. The paper that I'm going to read to you is an abbreviated form of my paper, so I left out all references to other authors than Husserl. What I want to do might seem paradoxical to some of you, because on the one hand I want to show how Husserl's phenomenology of the body allows for a kind of naturalization of transcendental phenomenology, and on the other hand I want to show that Husserl's phenomenology of the body is an important contribution to a renewed philosophy of subjectivity. So leaving the transcendental doesn't mean to leave all kinds of subjectivity or selfhood. What I don't deal with, and would be interesting as well, is Husserl's attempt towards a transcendental phenomenology of the body. So that's something I will not touch upon. So let me jump immediately right in the middle. Husserl's entire analysis of the lived body, Leib, I'm going to call it in the rest of my paper, as innovative as it is, still fits within the traditional metaphysical framework of the unity between body and soul. Husserl explicitly claims to follow the Platonic and Aristotelian conception of the different levels of the soul and of the function of the soul as the regulating principle of corporeal movements. Nevertheless, far from being the result of a unification of two distinct heterogeneous substances, for Husserl, the unity of body and soul, Leib and Seele, is a sui generis reality in which the two levels are not only inseparable, but also, to a large extent, indistinguishable. For Husserl, there is no Leib without a Seele, and no Seele without Leib. When one subtracts the Seele from the Leib, one reduces the latter, the Leib, to what Husserl calls a Körper, so a material thing. And when one abstracts from the Leib, the Seele is transformed into a pure spirit. So the mind-body account in Husserl excludes the reduction of the body to a material thing and the reduction of the mind to some kind of spirit. There is a philosophy of the spirit as well in Husserl. The unity of human beings is thus not the combination of a Körper with a Geist, material thing with spirit, and the decomposition of the primitive unity of Seele and Leib is always accompanied by the risk of dehumanization. However, the unity of Leib and Seele is said in Aristotle in many ways, depending on how one apprehends it. That is, this unity can be considered with regard to oneself and with regard to others. When considered with regard to oneself, it can be apprehended in its operative form or as an explicit content of consciousness, etc. You'll hear more on that. Although Leib and Seele are in constant solidarity, for Husserl they are not, for that matter, identical or even equivalent in every activity that results from a subjective initiative. The Leib serves the intentions of the soul. Even if there is no sensible perception of things without the contribution of the Leib, it is nevertheless less the Leib, for Husserl, than the soul, the Seele, that perceives. For Husserl, the Leib, as he often says, Schopenhauerian terminology, the Leib is the organ of a perception or the organ of the will when it comes to the voluntary movements of the body. One can thus say that for Husserl it is essentially the soul that, as an active principle, opens the lived body to the world. But it is not necessary to conclude that deprived of the direction of the soul and somehow left to itself, the Leib would fall into an inanimate, inert, and quasi-material torpor. This is not possible because even when left to itself, the Leib maintains its life, sensibility, and thus its bodily consciousness. Moreover, there are good reasons for thinking that the Leib that is insensible to its own life, and that is thus deprived of all affective relation with itself, would also be a poor organ of perception. For Husserl, without the regulating power of what he calls apprehensions of the soul, a bodily consciousness is, however, deprived of all intentional representation of an object. On its own, the Leib feels, it does not perceive in Husserl. But it does not only feel itself, it also feels the things that it touches. It feels the things and it feels itself, and these two forms of feeling are so intertwined that the body passes without transition from one to the other. Never lacking distinctions, Husserl describes at least 5 different kinds of bodily sensations. First, what he calls representative, darstellend, or hyletic sensations. For example, the sensation of red that is related to the perceived color of an object by means precisely of such an intentional apprehension. That take part in an intentional apprehension relating to the ethical, aesthetic, or practical value of an intentional object. For instance, appreciating the beauty of an object. 3, the kinesthetic sensations, or sensations of one's own body, of the movements of one's own body, that in turn lend themselves to an intentional apprehension, which, however, is limited to the perception of my body and to the way that its movements, voluntary or involuntary, motivate the way things appear. 4, what Husserl calls the Empfindnisse, not Empfindungen, but Empfindnisse, usually translated by sensings, which are sensations issuing from the contact between different parts of one Leib, or between the Leib, the body, and things. Even if these, let me stick to the German term, if these Empfindnisse lend themselves, at least secondarily, to intentional apprehension that informs us of the smooth or rough texture of a surface, of one's own body or thing, coldness and heat, the taste of food, etc., these sensing are originally a way the flesh to experience from within its contacts with itself or with things that it touches. 5, last kind of sensations, the sensations of tendency or drive that are related to the states of tension or relaxation of one's own body and that are translated by feelings of pleasure or displeasure. These new sensations make the body a flesh of pleasure, or more generally, the flesh of a libidinal sensibility that is at the same time both active and passive. Like the kinesthetic sensations, these sensations of pleasure are primarily related to an action, but contrary to the kinesthetic sensations, they hardly lend themselves to an intentional apprehension relating to things. This brief enumeration of different types of sensation has progressively led us from the body, the Leib, understood as the organ of an intentional perception that has its source in the soul, to the most intimate form of bodily sensibility, that is, to the heart of what the Leib feels by itself, and even what it feels when it only feels itself. Let us dwell for a moment on these sensations of contact of bodily touch that are so unique that Husserl distinguishes them from all other Empfindungen by reserving for them the name of Empfindnisse. In their most original state, these Empfindnisse are nothing more than the bodily sensation of being touched. Before we know if it is an accidental touch or an intentional touch, in German very nice, berühren, betasten, a caress or a grab, before even knowing what it is that touches me this way, I already feel, more or less confusedly, there I am touched. The bodily sensibility highlighted by the Empfindnisse doesn't only discern the intensity of a pleasure, but also the place where it is exercised. But the space of the place where my body feels itself touched is not the space of the extension of material things, of which my flesh, of course, hasn't the slightest idea. On the contrary, it is the intimate space of a feeling of a spreading out. Husserl uses another word than extension, Ausbreitung, spreading out of bodily sensibility that disperses over the surface of my body and sometimes reaches into the deepest layers of my body. However, it is necessary to concede that for me to feel touched in a more or less precise location on my body, the latter must already have constructed a system of places, a surface, or more generally, to refer to Merleau-Ponty, a body schema. Yet, there is a case in which the localization of the sensation of being touched and the constitution of the place and of the space of this touching go hand in hand, and that's the proper expression. Namely, when it is by my own hands that my body is touched. Passing my hands over the surface of my body, I explore my body in giving it a surface characterized by a certain spreading out, a certain Ausbreitung. For when I pass my hands over my forehead, at each point of contact with my forehead and my fingers, there is a crossing of sensations, of which some belong to my hands and others to my forehead. The sensations of the hand that explores the external surface of my body by touching it, on the one hand, and the sensations that consist in the internal sensing that my forehead feels at being touched. How should we distinguish between these two series of sensations that belong to different parts of my body and are yet so closely intertwined? For Husserl, this is in principle always possible because the sensibility of the active touch and of the passive being touched is not quite the same. Concerning active touch, it appears that the sensations are split into sensations that relate to the quality of what I touch and sensations that relate to the hands or another part of my body that touches. There is no equivalent of this in the passive being touched. That is, in principle, that is in the simple sensation that a part or surface of my body feels when it is touched by another body. Initially, the empfindnis, the sensing of being touched on a more or less precise location of my flesh, does not inform me about the properties of what touches me. Things change radically, however, when the touching and the touched both belong to different parts or surfaces of my flesh. Husserl gives the example of one hand touching the other hand, but my hand scratching my head, my 2 feet rubbing against one another. I was cold this night in my bed. 2 feet rubbing against one another, or my lips pressing against one another, would do just as well as the example of the 2 hands touching. In all these cases, it is one and the same flesh, and that only applies to my own flesh, that is and that simultaneously feels itself touching and touched. That is to say that the empfindnis that my left hand has of being touched is automatically related to the sensations of the right hand that touches. In this case, one cannot say that one hand doesn't know what the other is doing. It is in the intersection of different sensations belonging to my 2 hands that the fragments, at least, of the continuity and coherence of my body schema is constituted. But the intersection of the sensations belonging to each hand also allows one to experience within the same flesh the difference between one's organs or parts, continuity and difference. What my flesh feels at the points where my 2 hands touch is thus always related, according to Husserl, to both hands. In the hand that touches and in the hand that is touched, my body simultaneously explores itself from the outside and feels itself from the inside. This also means that the spreading out of the speciality deployed by the self-touching of the flesh concerns a surface that is sensible on both sides. And this is what one usually calls the skin. An early and particularly attentive reader of these analyses from Husserl's ideas too, Merleau-Ponty, of course, points out that in this play of touching touched, the roles are not assigned once and for all. Since we are dealing with parts of the same flesh, the hand that is touched can very easily and almost immediately touch them. When my right hand touches my left hand, the contact between my 2 hands can, at any moment, be reversed and changed into the bodily consciousness of my left hand touching my right hand. Contrary to appearances, this always possible shift does not speak in favor of a purely immanent self-affection of the flesh. The difference, not only between the left hand and the right hand, but also between the hand that touches and the hand that is touched, as well as the difference between what a hand feels from the inside and what a hand feels from the outside, is never abolished. The reversal in the touching touch is thus not a mere turning around, but as Merleau-Ponty does not tire of repeating, the reversibility of a role change in a play with 2 actors. In other words, it suffices that my left hand, touched by my right hand, touches by exploring the right hand to make my right hand lose its touch and become exclusively touched. This suggests that the events of this non-coincidence of the 2 hands, and more generally of the touching and the touched, that is, of this distance in proximity, of this separation of the inseparable, of this in-between, is the most original experience of bodily spatiality. The relation between spatiality and places would thus be like the relationship between the touching and the touched. But don't all places also necessarily maintain a relation to other places? And doesn't all space extend between different places? If so, is it then still conceivable to define the experience of the sensitive areas of the body in terms of the relation that the flesh maintains with itself in its solitary self-touching? Faced with these questions, a number of things must be addressed in order to understand the position of Husserl correctly. First, it is necessary to appreciate the gesture with which Husserl promotes touch to the status of the primordial experience of the flesh. When it comes to the constitution of the body, vision comes after touch, and a subject, Husserl says explicitly, deprived of touch would thus not be able to experience itself as a bodily subject. Second, Husserl never says that the consciousness of one's flesh in solitary self-touching genetically precedes the experience of a foreign flesh, that it would suffice to understand its significance. On the contrary, he indicated what, for example, the child's discovery of the expressive quality of her own voice owes to an early sensitivity to the voice of the mother. Further, he insists that the naturalization of my body, that is, understanding my body as a natural thing, necessarily presupposes an internalization of the gaze that only others can originally direct at me. It is thus for mythological, not for existential reasons, that Husserl chose a path that goes from the most intimate to the more objective in the way I live my body. His description of the solipsistic experience that I have of my body aims to explore both its appropriateness and its limits at the same time. In proceeding in this way, Husserl never goes as far as to attribute to me, by myself, all the power of bodily constitution, whether of my own body or the body of others. For Husserl, one can no more deduce the entire meaning of the body of others from the experience that I have of my own body than reduce the intimate experience that I have of my flesh to an identification with the way that I appear to others. In the following step of the solipsistic constitution of my flesh, Husserl interrogates the way my sensible flesh is part of a mundane environment whose laws, to a certain extent, it is subjected to. What is most remarkable about these relations of dependency that bind the sensible reality of the flesh to a different type of reality is that they concern what Husserl calls circumstances arising from both the states of my body's environment and of my body itself, insofar as my body is taken up in the mode of functioning of material bodies. All bodily consciousness is in fact dependent on both worldly conditions that are more or less favorable to its development and to the proper functioning of the brain. It is not always easy to distinguish the threads that are intertwined in Husserl's exploration of what he calls the conditionalities of the body. So, how the body depends on external circumstances. First, one has to expand the exploration of states, qualities, and capacities of the flesh by paying attention to everything that is only revealed in its interaction with the environment, and therefore not in its self-affection, not in the sensings. Then one has to elucidate the exact nature of this functional link that makes bodily consciousness dependent on physical stimulations and neurophysiological processes. More specifically, one has to understand how the causality of processes investigated by the natural sciences can affect bodily consciousness while maintaining, Husserl insists on that, the ontophenomenological thesis that these processes cannot cause bodily experiences and their contents. Finally, this investigation of the connections of a functional correspondence between states of bodily consciousness and the material circumstances of the natural world and the brain has to be brought to bear on an ontological determination of what type of reality the sensible flesh is. Concerning the first issue, Husserl does not seem prepared to give up his desire to distinguish between forms of conditionality affecting either the life or the soul. Particularly bodily, according to Husserl, are the conditional qualities that relate to the sensibility of the life vis-à-vis what affects it from the outside. The intimate experience of a sensing in relation to the observation of the material occasion of its occurrence reveals what Husserl calls appropriately Empfindsamkeit, or bodily sensibility. This bodily sensibility is conditioned by the state, more or less receptive, normal or abnormal, in which my body finds itself, either temporarily or habitually. Conditionalities now of the soul, making the Seele the active principle of bodily consciousness. Husserl attributes conditionalities to it that either come from its bodily components, what he calls the psychophysical conditionalities, previous experiences, what he calls the idiopsychic conditionalities, or the social environment, what he calls intersubjective conditionalities. All these relations of dependency weigh on the current functioning of the soul, that is, on the acuteness of its perception, on its inclinations towards a certain type of perception rather than another, on how its perception deals with the gaze of others, etc. Again, the weight of this dependency does not only affect the current state of the soul, this dependency weighs on its habitual mode of being. It turns out that Husserl's distinction between the two series of conditional properties of bodily consciousness, soul and body, is not without advantages, provided, of course, that they, soul and body, are not opposed to one another. Because the mode of being of the flesh is a mixture of the vulnerability or of the Empfindsamkeit, the sensibility, on the one hand, in its capabilities to cope, that is, its dispositions or devices to reply. Thus, living flesh passes imperceptibly from receptivity to activity, from virtuality to actuality. Although, in its phenomenological ontology of the reality of the soul, Husserl deems it a substance, saying that the soul is some kind of substance, despite the continual flux of carnal consciousness, the permanence of the being of the soul, substantial permanence of the being of the soul, is only revealed, he says, through conditional implications in worldly circumstances. This functional understanding of its substance ensures that the subsisting mode of being of the soul, far from basking in the pride of its closed-off self-sufficiency, is instead marked by dependency, finitude, and transcendence. It is a dependent soul. One does not fall into naturalism, and naturalism that would be incompatible with a phenomenological analysis of the flesh, simply by conceding that its sensorial states depend on the concomitant system of real circumstances under which it senses. These real circumstances, taken in themselves, undoubtedly arise within natural causality. The light that my visual perception depends on, the intensity or pitch of a sound, and the way it affects the parts of my inner ear, the way, Husserl's example, a chemical serotonin affects my brain and makes me see everything in yellow, are the subject of scientific observations and theories, of which philosophy can question the presuppositions and limits, but not in principle the legitimacy. However, the phenomenologist's aim is to point out that all we can actually observe is a relation of dependency between bodily experiences and the material circumstances that bring them about. A relation that has the form of what Husserl calls motivation, the motivation of if-then. The phenomenologist will hasten to add that it is impossible, in principle, for a bodily state of consciousness to be caused by material action. Husserl thus seems to want to say that, on the one hand, bodily consciousness depends on material causes, and that, on the other hand, since this consciousness is of a different ontological nature than physical nature, it necessarily escapes this causality. Husserl is thus forced to concede that, I quote, reality and unreality or irreality mutually exclude one another and, on the other hand, essentially require one another, end quote. New distinctions are therefore needed. The first consists in pointing out that my body as a phenomenological, or as Husserl calls it, aesthesiological flesh, and my body as Körper, endowed with somatological properties, are numerically identical and ontologically different. But since Husserl is not satisfied with this thesis of a numerical identity and an ontological difference between the aesthesiological flesh and the somatological body, how should we understand then their interaction? For Husserl it is clear that the neurological changes of my body cannot cause the sensations of my flesh. Should we then say that there is a strict parallelism between the phenomena of the aesthesiological flesh and of the somatological body? Husserl discusses the hypothesis of what he calls psychophysical parallelism at length. And it appears at the end from this discussion that for reasons of principle, the reciprocity between bodily consciousness and the brain does not lend itself to a parallelist interpretation. This refusal in principle is based for Husserl on a double series of arguments. So arguments against psychophysical parallelism. The first arguments are ontological and methodological and oppose the irreality of bodily consciousness to the material reality of neurological processes, just as the absolute validity of the laws of eidetic phenomenology concerning bodily consciousness and the merely hypothetical validity of the laws of natural science. The second, in my view, more phenomenological series of arguments attempt to highlight phenomena of consciousness, such as the structure of internal time consciousness, or the marginal consciousness of the horizon of virtual givens, for which one cannot find easily a neurological equivalent or explanation. There is no doubt that with the examination of the different forms of conditionality that attach my flesh to the fabric of the world and expose it to the solicitations of material causality, the solipsist investigation of its mode of being has reached its limits. This investigation took us from the intimacy of the sensings of being touched to the appearance of the flesh as a thing. What can no longer be touched but only actually be observed are relations that make my flesh a part of material nature. At the conditions of this, at the conclusion of this phenomenological ontological investigation conducted in the sphere of solipsistic experience, my body turns out to be, I quote Husserl, a thing of a very particular type, or, nice, a subjective object. The thing that my body has become is essentially subjective, and it is different from all other surrounding things because it relates to all these other things, because it relates all these other things to itself. For me, my body thing can never fully blend into the network of other things because it is through it that these things exist for me. My body remains subjective even when I abstract from its function as organ of the will and as an organ of perception, because it is what comports itself as a center or 0 point of orientation. The lift, I quote Husserl, the lift body then has the unique distinction of bearing in itself the 0 points of all orientations. One of its spatial points is always characterized in the mode of the ultimate central here. It is thus that all things of the surrounding world possess an orientation to this lift body. The far is a far from me, from my lift body. The to the right refers back to the right side of my lift body, for instance, to my right, which is to say to my right hand. End of quote. Wherever it goes and whatever it does, my body thing is always here and never there. What ultimately resists all my attempts to make by myself my body into a simple thing is thus its central point of view. That is the place it assigns to itself within a spatiality that originates from it, and that thus never falls together with the extension of objective space. The spreading out not only of the sensings on the surface of my flesh, but of my body thing beyond its limits and beyond its present place, thus never frees itself from the anchor point, from this absolutely minimal consciousness, from this metaphysical point of individuation, as Leibniz called it, from this most insignificant absolute that constitutes its here. Here is the mark that makes this thing my body. Here is the name of the most primitive and most bodily subjectivity. Everything changes when we give up this mythological artifice that has thus far led us to abstract from the existence of another flesh than our own. In the discovery of another flesh, the new experience of another here that is there imposes itself on my flesh. But how can I transport myself to that distant place, to this place at the same time different from my place and implied in it? This reciprocity between places that are originally correlated and yet foreign to one another is not unlike the structure of those other forms of reciprocity between the same and the other that we have already encountered. We discovered that any relation of reciprocity or mutual implication necessarily lends itself to a reading in a double sense. This also holds for the relation that my flesh from its place establishes with the place of a foreign flesh. My constitution of another flesh is inseparable for Husserl from my experience of the modification an expansion that this foreign flesh introduces into my own flesh. In the relation between different flesh, any constitution is thus necessarily a co-constitution. According to Husserl, we cannot transport it into the place of another flesh without being reminded of the relation of reciprocity that already governs the interaction of my Seele with my life, of my soul with my body. It is in fact this intimate experience of difference within my bodily consciousness that gives me, by analogy, access to a similar but inaccessible double bodily ipseity of the other. If I did not already have, by touch or by sight, an external perception of my body, I could never leave, by my own strength, the self-affection of my flesh and open myself to the sensing of a foreign flesh. The analogy between my flesh and the flesh of others, however, is based on the perception that makes me as attentive to the difference as to the similarity between the way my life and certain other life appear to me. This difference is palpable. My lived body is here, and its sensible and intentional life is given to me as originally as its external appearances. In the touching touched, its private life and its surface are both simultaneously given. They are originally, Husserl says, co-presence for me. This is not so in the appearance of the body of another. What is originally given to me, in this case, is only her external appearance. More needs to be given, however, if I am to be able to distinguish between the perception of a material, worldly thing and the perception of a foreign body. If the analogy between me and the other relates to the fact that we both experience our bodies as a double presence or as an originary co-presence of body and soul, and if this analogy must be based on a phonological given, then it is necessary that the soul that animates the body of others manifests itself to me in some way, even if only as an inaccessible given, a donation in withdrawal. Husserl understands this bodily relation of others in terms of the phenomenon of expression. According to this analysis, the bodily behavior of others testifies to an inner life that I can never penetrate and that I can never make originally present to myself. However, I can apprehend, or as Husserl appropriately calls it, appresent it. The analogy between me and the other that concerns two occurrences of an originary co-presence is accompanied once again by reversal. While for my bodily consciousness of myself, the sensings of my flesh is more primitive than its appearance as a Leibkörper, the appearance of the expressive body of others comes first and constitutes, for me at least, an essential condition for the representation of their sensings. If we look closer, we discern at the heart of this meeting between distinct and most often separate fleshes a second reversal. For the expressive body of another is not just the way that the other is first given to me, it is also, by right and simply, the first expressive body that is given to me. The other's body is the first expressive body. The way of analogy that led me from the co-presence of my flesh to the co-presence of a foreign flesh returns to me by giving to my flesh an expressivity similar to what I have discovered in the presence of